My name is Bert Brunecreef. I'm with the University of Utrecht, the Institute for Risk Assessment Sciences. We became interested in traffic pollution when a local official in the Netherlands who was worried about the health effects of living close to busy roads came to us and wanted us to do a study to look at kids living close to busy roads and going to school on busy roads. We went to, in total, 6 different roads and found that the roads were different in terms of traffic density, but also traffic composition. The way we disentangled truck traffic and car traffic was to select roads which had very different traffic composition, so that the correlation between car traffic and truck traffic was essentially 0. And then we found that if we looked at both as a exposure variable, that the truck traffic was always the one that was associated with various health effects, and the car traffic density was not. So we found differences in lung function, differences in respiratory symptoms, very much related to the trucks rather than the total traffic volume. After the first study, we did a much bigger one, going to 24 different areas. And we found that the kids going to school along busy roads with a lot of truck traffic density, again this is mostly diesel or all diesel exhaust, they had more symptoms. And we also found that when they were sensitized to allergens, when they had twitchy airways, bronchial hyperreactivity as we say, that especially those kids were the most vulnerable. The bronchial reactivity and the sensitization to allergens themselves were not very much related to the exposures, but once they had that, they got a lot more symptoms when they had these exposures. We've been interested in long-term effects of air pollution on mortality ever since the early 1990s, when the first results of US studies came out. The Netherlands, the country that I'm from, is too small to get the same type of contrasts that you have in the United States between cities that are far away from each other. So then we decided to look for contrasts related to exposure to traffic, living close to busy roads, living further away, and to use an existing cohort study that was set up to look at nutrition and cancer, but which was spread out all over the Netherlands, to use that existing cohort study and then estimate exposure to traffic pollution for the members of that cohort study, and then to see whether we could find a signal that was related to mortality. We use existing monitoring data and then existing geographic information on where the roads exactly are, how busy they are, how high the population density is in the areas where people live. And I use all that information to estimate air pollution concentrations at the home address. When you focus on traffic, soot is an important pollutant. It's a component of fine particles in the air, and we measure that actually quite simply by measuring the reflectance of the filters that are collected in the field. It's a very old method actually. It used to be called black smoke or British standard smoke in the old days, but and it proves to be very highly correlated with elemental carbon, which is an important component in diesel soot. We've also looked at nitrogen oxides, nitrogen dioxide in our studies. We need to realize that the correlation between these different traffic pollutants tends to be very high, so it's not usually possible to separate out the effects of one from the other. We found a few things. We found that the mortality in the cohort was related to fine particles, PM2.5, in much the same way as was found in the big American Cancer Society study. So the effect estimates were really almost the same for this particular component. We also found that participants who lived really close to busy roads, that they had an additional risk of dying prematurely. So that was something that we could look at in this context of a study on traffic pollution, which is not possible in a study like ACS, which is primarily looking at contrasts between different cities in the United States. The last thing that we felt was important is that we also had access to a noise pollution model. There's always been this question, if you find effects especially on the cardiovascular system, is it air pollution from traffic or is it noise from air pollution, which also affects the cardiovascular system? And we found rather convincingly that the air pollution effects were totally insensitive to the noise effects, and that the noise effects, which we also saw, tended to be decreased after taking air pollution into account. 15, 20 years ago or more, we tended to look at respiratory diseases only, because of course air pollution is something you inhale and must affect the lungs and the airways. But in the last 15 years or so, it has become clear that the cardiovascular system is also very much affected. And this is probably partly because inflammatory mediators get from the lungs into the bloodstream and to the heart. And to some extent, very small particles may also enter the bloodstream and have a direct effect on the vessels and on the heart. The most recent studies, including our own, are finding an effect of exposure to air pollution in the current day and age and lung cancer. We have some clear indications that traffic is important, but traffic is composed of many different sources. It's not only road traffic, but it's diesel trains, it's shipping emissions, maybe even aircraft emissions, although those tend to be above ground rather than on the ground. So there is room for further work to disentangle the different sources, the different components. That's one thing. The other thing, which I think is very important, is that if traffic pollution is important, the highest exposures occur while participating in traffic. And we actually do not know very much yet about what the exact exposures are for cyclists, for people taking the bus, people going on trains, commuting in their cars, and what acute or chronic effects those types of exposures may have. The work we've done on traffic has been important, I think, because it has focused our attention on local pollution. You always live in a local situation and not in the whole world, so to speak. It gives people a handle to do something about their situation in a different way than when you have to address things like ozone pollution, the hole in the ozone layer, and things like that, which are more or less the same over very large areas and which require another type of policy to deal with it. Some recent studies show that what we call the non-exhaust particulate matter, so that's particles not coming from the tailpipe, are actually having a large contribution to particles measured near roadways. Those are particles which come from tire wear, they come from brake wear, it's resuspended road dust, and in some instances the contribution of that to the total particle load is actually larger than the tailpipe emissions. We still know very little about the toxicity, the health risks of those kinds of particles, and that's an area that I think we should really understand much better than we do now, because it would mean that if we would go to zero exhaust vehicles, electric vehicles, whatever other trick you can think of to make vehicles emission free, you would still be left with the other emissions. And if those are important in terms of health risks, we better find out soon. Well, something that has very little to do with traffic pollution is wildfires, partly related to climate change, I think, are becoming more and more prominent. The other thing is the burning of biomass, where sugarcane, for example, is being grown for biofuel combustion. In southern Brazil, for example, the sugarcane is being burned on the field as part of the production process. There are areas in southern Brazil which are clouded in smoke for half of the year. And some studies are now showing clearly that kids exposed to this smoke are being hospitalized with asthma because of the smoke, and it's related to biofuel production, which is supposed to make cars cleaner. So that's an irony, I think, which we shouldn't forget.